So initially I was a bit sad to be in the last panel. Usually when we get at this stage of conferences, we are tired, looking forward to the next day. But watching the presentations, I think it makes a lot of sense to be presenting now, because what I'm trying to do with this paper and this work relates to so much that has been presented. So actually excited to be trying to connect many of these presentations and insights into this paper that it is trying to look at, I would argue, are the epistemological effects of AI systems in the Global South. This is both a conceptual and empirical work, and I used some examples from Brazil in terms of the empirical side of this research, but I'm mostly interested in discussing a conceptual normative approach to this issue, right? And I bring forward back one comment that I had I think yesterday, that is, I think we are also negotiating here among ourselves imaginaries, right? When we were discussing this, there is the negotiations of imaginaries of AI in the Global South, but there is also negotiations in this room in order how are we making sense of everything that is happening. In this presentation, I'll bring up my imagination about it, or some part of my imagination about it. Unfortunately, it might sound a bit somber, right? It's not as excited, and I think I echo some of the somber imaginaries that have been discussed so far. This research starts with this observation that I think it is becoming increasingly clear that the countries and the stakeholders that are going to be able to be developing AI around the world are very specific, right? We are probably talking about a handful of countries that are going to be able to develop this infrastructure, and probably a handful of companies as well, right? That have so much concentration in terms of compute power, of energy, of the infrastructures that we were just discussing. 5 years ago, that wasn't perhaps so clear, right? But as we go forward, we see that the investment is happening in very specific jurisdictions. And we have the USA, China, we have some Gulf states that are investing in that, right? United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia as well. So there is an increased focus, and it's becoming increasingly clear who are going to be leading this AI race. When I talk about AI infrastructure, I'm sorry, I can change a little bit what I was hoping to say. I'm thinking about, it is a very big generalization, but I think it illustrates a bit that there are mainly two groups of infrastructure to think about AI. One is about data centers, and when I think about data centers, we are thinking about inferences process, right? So it is, when you do a prompt, the model already exists, it already has a very defined algorithm, but it has to do some inferences, some mathematical calculations to provide you an output. This needs data centers, and these data centers are being developed around the world. So we have the case in Brazil, in India, and the need to develop this localized infrastructure is also because of some governance requirements in terms of data localization, right? In terms of data sovereignty, digital sovereignty. So these concepts are articulated in this idea that we need localized data centers for inferences. But then we have another type of infrastructure that is more focused on training specifically, right? So to train a model is extremely resource intensive, right? We are talking about a lot of capital, a lot of compute power, a lot of energy, and this is not something that every country, every stakeholder can do. This is very specific countries, very specific stakeholders that have all this constellation of factors to do that, and particular money, right? And if we start looking at rankings of who are the countries that are being able to do that, we see a clear pattern that the ones that are being able to do that are not countries in the Global South, right? This is, I think, an observation that we have been sharing in this last couple of days. They're focused on the Global North, and also are specific actors in the Global North. So we're not talking about Europe as a whole, right? We have some European countries that are trying to develop this ecosystem. We've got China, United States, India pushing forward in some aspects, but it's not a general trend. This has a very strong digital divide to that. This is a rank by Tortoise, which is a British media that is doing some work in artificial intelligence. We have different types of rankings that use different standards to think about how to rank that. But usually we can also look at the data that the general trend is, well, this is very concentrated in some countries, and not divided or shared by other countries, right? And this is interesting, noticing also in the plans that are being developed around the world. And here I highlight the two AI strategies, one from my home country, that is Brazil, but also when you look and read the AI plan for the United Kingdom, there's this interesting work by a group of researchers at the Tony Blair Institute. They are discussing as well that the United Kingdom does not have enough capital, power, compute infrastructure to be able to be developing their own models, right? So what they're recommending is that we need to build the data centers to be able to harness the economic benefits of artificial intelligence, but we should not be focusing on training our own models because we will not be able to compete with the countries that actually have the power to do so. Now, you might ask, okay, but why is that the issue, right? Are we just interested in harnessing economic benefits in our countries? And here I bring, I think, a very interesting tweet by this very disgusting
oh, our favorite human.
One of the worst ones. But I think it captures a bit of the zeitgeist of this process, right? When he's saying that we actually need to be reshaping knowledge and the knowledge systems, human knowledge around the world. And this is probably shared by many of the tech people that are in the Silicon Valley. Recently there was, I can't remember this name of this guy that was discussing, it was an interview that became famous on discussing transhumanism and how these are imaginations. These people share certain imaginations. They are in the power of developing this type of infrastructure that are going to be deployed in our countries, right? So in that sense, they are reshaping authority, right? As we were discussing yesterday, knowledge infrastructures. They are making design choices that have downstream applications in our parts of the world. So how to make sense about this, right? How do we discuss how the systems are going to mediate human knowledge, right? Both in terms of production of human knowledge and also how we share human knowledge, how we access it. But they are embedded in very specific ideas of what's human knowledge, what's the word, what's reality. And to bring this forward, I'm trying to think about this idea of algorithmic epistemicide. This is situated in previous research, especially postcolonial theory, right? And I'm thinking specifically about Boaventura de Souza Santos, which talks about this idea of epistemicide, and also Miranda Finker, who is currently at NYU philosophy department. And they both, through these concepts, they more or less discuss this idea of the suppression of knowledge systems through colonialism and modernity, right? And I'm thinking about feeding on these discussions to try to adapt to our current modernity, to current algorithmic context. Now, I think there are very historical meeting points about what this scholarship brings forward, what I think we are discussing. At the same time, I think there are very specificities, there are specific factors to how these AI systems are constructed, right? Some of this, again, I think we are touching on this collectively, but there is this issue of contestation. I think it's important to think about. In previous post-colonial contexts, although contestation was often suppressed, there were still very somewhat possible spaces of articulation for contestation, either through, let's say, political representation or actually even military contestation, if you think about more revolutionary processes, right? The type of contestation there were possibilities of articulation. In technical systems, this becomes more harder, right? The technology has some assumptions within how it is deployed, how it is designed, that it doesn't allow for so much contestation, right? How do you contest an algorithm? How do you contest an output, right? Some people will say that, well, one way is to we have alternatives such as create filters, that when the algorithm is in place, we can develop some technical strategies to that. But then there is a second thing, that is these systems, the way they are developed, the way they are trained, the training sticks, right? I don't know if this notion has been, if you have come across this idea, but when a model is trained and it learns something about it, it is almost impossible to take that learning outside the model. You can try to suppress its outputs, you can try to create strategies within the algorithm to provide other outputs, but the way it works, it will always be embedded in its calculations. So you don't have enough space for contestation, and you don't have enough space for making this model in another way. It is deployed in a very constrained way. Okay, and I think this brings forward the importance of us to think about all these issues normatively, doctrinally, but also technically, right? I think we need to be able to be understanding how the systems work, and I'm trying to do this effort in thinking about the process of the machine learning to see where the algorithmic epistemicide takes place. And in practical terms, I thought about bringing two cases from Brazil that I think illustrate that more clearly. One is about this platform which is called ISPGO, that was developed by Igarapé Institute, which is a very active think tank in Brazil. It has a very social relevance and causes. It is very socially sensitive to causes, but it developed back in 2019 this platform that maps violence in Rio de Janeiro. It's a public-private partnership, and it uses some standards and it uses a model. It developed a model that uses certain standards about violence to come up with these maps. In doing so, it propels certain understandings of violence, right? Such as, let's say, cell phone robbery, armed robbery, and those ideas. But other types of violence or understandings of violence are suppressed by this model. So if you think about police violence, right? If you think about, let's say, political suppression, sometimes you have political mobilizations in some poor communities in favelas that are suppressed by the police. That could be an understanding of violence as well that is not necessarily represented by these maps. So this is one example of this algorithmic epistemicide in the idea that this algorithm does not acknowledge other types of understanding about violence. And another example is these two programs that were developed in Brazil for welfare protection and welfare support in Brazil. And in the last few years, they have been increasingly using algorithms to try to identify fraud detection. So we are talking about programs of millions of individuals that are registered there. You don't have a manual, a hand-coded way of identifying fraud. So they're using these automatic processes to try to do so. But in the last years, we have been seeing an increased number of people coming out to say that they have been excluded from this program without legitimate causes, right? And in that sense, we can think about how, for instance, these algorithms might think about fraud or, let's say, the everyday conditions of work and surviving in different ways that some poor community think about how surviving through, let's say, informal economies. So if you're part of the informal economy, the algorithm might say, okay, you don't need this support, but and these communities might think, no, well, the informal economies still put me in a marginalized situation. So we see tensions, conflicts in how the algorithm thinks and how we have these localized knowledge systems about life and henceforth. So pretty much that's the work I'm trying to do. Very much appreciate your attention and any comments you might have, and well, happy to connect here or afterwards in our social medias and algorithms. Thank you.